Hello and welcome to A Closer Walk Catholic Communications. I'm Father Bayer, your host, and we're glad that you can join us. I believe in one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church. We don't really think about that other than the fact that we want to make sure we keep up with everyone else while we're reciting it together. But being one church speaks to the universality of the church. Worldwide, most of us think of church as our parish church and our parish priest, and that's our experience of church. But when we talk about one, we're really talking about universality, and when we talk about apostolic, we're talking about the work of the church universal worldwide. That's why today it's a very great pleasure to have with us, basically they call him the permanent observer, but he's the Vatican's representative at the United Nations, Archbishop Bernardino Alza. Archbishop, welcome. We're very glad to welcome you to Closer Walk.
Thank you, Father.
Archbishop, the universality of the church. You're probably the guy who knows this better than anyone else in the church, including the Holy Father. No, and that is... But when we talk about the universality of the church, as you represent the church at the United Nations, the church universal, the presence of the church, what are some of the issues that in the UN that the church represents, deals with, and how is the universality of the church expressed there?
Indeed, the universality, the Catholicity of the church is, we might say, a very parallel idea to the United Nations. The United Nations representing all the 193 countries in the world, plus the Holy See as a permanent observer state, and then in 2012 also the state of Palestine. So there are 195 countries, states represented at the United Nations. When Paul VI came to the United Nations, the first pope to visit the United Nations in 1964, one of the really beautiful ideas that he mentioned, that he affirmed in his speech to the General Assembly of the United Nations was that said, I'd love to think he expressed appreciation for the United Nations. He said this lofty institution that represents, all the countries in the world, all the nations in the world. That's why I said I would like to think of it as also a kind of a parallel idea of the universal church, of the Catholic Church, which is present in all countries in the world, in all peoples. And so he said that in terms of its, you might say, structure, he said there is similarity there is parallelism there, and also in terms of its ideals, of something, of an institution representing all nations, all peoples in the world. So in that sense, the Catholic Church, the Holy See, has this idea in mind when it appreciates the United Nations as a forum for all the nations, all the countries in the world, and at the same time as something that really represents the universality of humanity. Yeah.
Bishop, being born an American, I think of Christianity as being widely accepted. Of course, there's some different denominations where we have doctrinal differences, but Christianity in general, at least as an American, that's a given concept. Now I realize that's not true worldwide, that Christianity is not widely accepted, and I'm thinking of dealing with countries where Christianity is very, very foreign. What do they have to offer us? What do we have to offer them? How do we communicate with these countries where Christianity in some places in the world is
persecuted?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's very true. As a matter of fact, Pope Francis has repeatedly affirmed that Christianity has never been as persecuted as it is now. We have more martyrs in our, in our times.
Yes. We don't know that. That's not in our morning newspaper. That's not in our lived experience. Give us some examples and some idea of what's really going on in the world in terms of people who are suffering for the faith.
Yeah, there are several very qualified, very good reports, some annual, some biannual reports on the state of religious freedom in the world. And these reports, whether it's the report of the State Department of the U.S. government, or above all of the Papal Foundation Aid to the Church in Need, that there are around practically 250 million Christians who are persecuted in our time. So much more than the primitive Christianity, which was officially banned, which officially persecuted. Especially, these things, we know above all, I think these the things when there was the persecution of the Christians in the Middle East and part of what they call the ISIS, the ISIS, the Islamic State of the Levant, as as it is also called, or the Islamic State. So this persecution has come into focus because of that. But indeed, in other parts of the world, persecution against the Christians, against against religious freedom, has been very, very rampant in the last years. Yeah.
Examples being?
According to the reports of not only of the ones I mentioned, but also other non-governmental organizations and other foundations focusing on religious freedom, one dominant characteristic of the persecution against Christians are, the Middle East, because it was very obvious, and then in other predominantly Islamic countries which don't accept, in a sense, a pluralistic society, and then in dictatorial regimes in some parts of the world where religion in general is not allowed or is completely regulated by the state, and part of that is Christianity, especially against Catholics, because Catholics, as you know very well, we have the specific characteristic of our universality is that it has found its institutional framework in the papacy. So we have a universal pastor, we have a universal authority to which we respond to. And, there are examples in the world, of course, in which that fidelity to the Pope has created problems to Catholics.
Now, I know in China, they talk about the church underground, and people having to go underground. Is it just not being allowed, or is it people are really, giving their lives? We've heard all the wonderful stories of the saints and the martyrs, and how rather than denounce God, they were, they gave their life in a variety of situations in the early church.
Yes.
Is that still predominant today?
It certainly is. I mean, especially the recent cases in the Middle East. I mean, the martyrs, as the Holy Father said, we have more martyrs now than in the early, in primitive Christianity, simply because persecutions, and there are also more Christians now, much more Christians than before. But these are certainly martyrs in our times. There are people who have sacrificed their lives not only directly to faith, of course, that's martyrdom, sacrifice your life for Christ, but also indirectly. Yesterday we celebrated the feast of St. Maximilian Kolbe. That's the example of the first really example of martyrdom in which it does not necessarily have to be directly you are persecuted for your faith, but you have given your life for somebody else because of your faith. And so there are so many examples of that in our times. People who helped other people and who sacrifice not necessarily their lives, but the other goods they have, the comfort, etc., simply because they follow their own conscience, they follow the dictates of their own religious beliefs. That's true.
Now, and I know there are countries, and I'm not asking you to name them, but in an area where Christianity is not accepted, not recognized, and oftentimes people give their lives. You're an ambassador for all intents and purposes. Do we have any interaction with these countries? Do we even dialogue with these countries? Is there any hope that they're going to start to recognize and understand what we're asking?
Yes, we do have with most of these countries we have official diplomatic relations. I mean, you mentioned all the countries in the Middle East except Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and all the other countries in the Middle East. We have diplomatic relations with Iraq, for instance, where most of the cases of the recent persecution of the minority ancient Christian communities and populations in northern Iraq or part of the Kurdish Iraq. And so we have, the problem there is we have good relations, even formal relations with Iraq and the government of Iraq. The problem is the people, the groups who are persecuting the Christians and other ethnic and religious minorities in the area are beyond the control of the state. They are what we called, which is now which has been a new phenomenon in terrorism. We call the non-state actors. So, in a sense, of course, the country has the responsibility. The government of a state has responsibility to control these groups. But the problem is whether or not these states have been strong enough in order to stop these persecutions or violence against minorities, whether they're ethnic or religious.
So we're talking about the Hezbollah and the ISIS,
the ISIS,
the Boko Haram and that group.
Because really the direct persecutions against the Christians and other ethnic and religious minorities in the Middle East recently, 1914, 1915, 1916, and at the present time, of course, there is now going on some reconstruction in the Nineveh Plains, where most of the ancient Christian communities have always lived. Now, there is less direct persecutions now because, for instance, ISIS is defeated as a territory, but not necessarily as an ideology. So that's why there is a continued threat from not only from ISIS, but also from other similar extremist fundamentalist groups out there. So we have to be certainly always aware that there is always the possibility that wherever they are, they would persecute against the Christians, not necessarily in the Middle East.
We're all familiar with ISIS. We're familiar with Hezbollah. We're familiar with Boko Haram. Are there other areas of the country? I'm sure there are, and I'm asking, what other groups are there out there that people are falling to?
There are what we call splinter groups, or groups in other countries which define themselves to be either a part of that, we might say, international terror groups, affiliates, local affiliates, like in the Philippines, for instance, where I come from. There was, some of the Filipino Muslims who went to join the Taliban in Afghanistan. When they returned home, they established their own group. It's called the Abu Sayyaf, or in English, it's the Sword of God, as you know very well. So these groups, and there are certain groups in Indonesia. These are the groups who have been kidnapping priests, missionaries, and really, I mean, some of these groups have evolved into a kind of ransom, kidnapping for ransom, so to finance themselves. So these are just few of the examples of local terrorist groups which are either really seriously inspired by these international terrorist groups like Al Qaeda or like ISIS, and which have caused sufferings and persecutions in the local level in these countries where they are. Yeah.
Archbishop, stay with that. We're going to be back in just a moment. Stay with us. We'll be back with you. Hello and welcome back to Closer Walk Catholic Communications. I'm Father Bayer, your host, and we're glad that you came back. We are talking about the universality of the church. We opened up by the reminder that we're one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. We are universal, and we are apostolic. The work of the church is not only to build churches, but to answer the question, Lord, when did we see you hungry, naked, ill, or in prison? And that's a worldwide task of Holy Mother Church to reach out to those people in need. Again, we welcome back Archbishop Bernardito Alza, the permanent observer or the U.S. representative at the United Nations. Archbishop Alza, welcome back.
Thank you.
Being an apostolic church, being a Catholic, a universal church, the work of the UN, the work of all the nations gathered together, I don't think most people understand just how universal our response is to the least among us. Would you tell us something about the work?
Yes, indeed. The Catholic Church, at the United Nations in 2015, there was a huge, probably the most ambitious agenda the United Nations has ever approved. It's called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with its 17 goals and 169 targets and 250 indicators, all those things. But looking at it, it's like just kind of the United Nations putting into writing what the Catholic Church does every day. There has been a greater really recognition at the United Nations. I could say that because I have been at the United Nations. This is my 7th year at the United Nations. There's been a greater recognition of how faith-based institutions, faith-based organizations are really the leading edge of achieving development goals in the world. This has been proven with the predecessor of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was called the Millennium Development Goals, when most of the evaluations really made it clear that faith-based organizations are one of those protagonists on the ground who have achieved something. And the Catholic Church, of course, is the biggest of that institution. Just for example, health. I mean, do you imagine that the Church is the biggest non-state provider, for instance, of care for people who are suffering with HIV/AIDS? The Church is the biggest provider of that. Around 25% of AIDS sufferers are taken care of by the Church, especially in Africa. People won't know that because the Church has put so much investment into health and education. And this is true. Probably few would know that we have more than 100,000 schools in the world. And the majority of the schools are in developing countries, in places where the state is absent. I mean, I know from experience when I was in Madagascar, when I was in Haiti, I'm talking about just a few years ago. I was in Haiti 2008, 2014. So you say that the Catholic education system is much bigger than the state. I can say that with certainty, and not only in terms of size and of reach, but also in terms of quality. So the Church plays a huge role in terms of being universal also in its actions, and in terms of all the actual needs of people. I mean, if you look at this development agenda, it's first it's hunger, fight hunger, and then it's health, it's education, it's making water available to all, the right to water, the right to peaceful societies, and all these things. They have always been the concern of the Church, and now the United Nations has come kind of turn around and make it a kind of a policy, make a very, very powerful political declaration, because it is not obligatory. It's still a political direction in spite of it was adopted by all the countries in the world, but it remains a political declaration. So nobody is really obliged to achieve or to implement these development goals. But they have always been the goals of the Church. Of course, we know very well that the Church is not only kind of in her mission, it's not only spiritual, but it's also to help, as we said, realize in the concrete the call to see Jesus in those in need.
The temporal needs.
The temporal needs. So the people, we call that also temporal works of mercy anyway. So,
yeah. And I'm going to kind of go off script here and say, at this point in time, and you and I were discussing this earlier, we're dealing with the abuse crisis, unfortunately, for many years now, and things are slowly leaking out. And I think that everyone sees the bad news and says that's the church.
Yeah.
And what they don't see is the good news. They don't see the good news of everything that the church is doing. And I remember very vividly in the middle of this when the church was really being castigated for the actions of some bad priest. And someone came out and said, God, do you realize how many children are educated every day? How many homeless are sheltered every day? How many hungry are fed every day? How many sick are cared for every day? And I think this is a very positive reminder, because I remember back at the turn of the century when our ambassador to the Holy See was Jim Nicholson, and I met with him and he was talking about, we had all this food to give away, but because it was genetically modified, there were people, and there's political reasons. You know, it was the anti-U.S. thing, and they weren't allowing their people to have food, would rather let them starve for political reasons. How difficult is the work of the church, you know, and caring for the people because of politics?
It is difficult, but also, you know, the huge advantage of institutions like the Catholic Church is, above all, what we have been talking about. It's universal, so it's present in every corner, really, practically, of the world, except that in some places where it is a very small reality. But you know, because it is for instance, at the United Nations, and we could only be credible if we have facts to back our claims, our statements. When you talk about development, when we talk about feeding the hungry, when we talk about education, the importance of healthcare, etc. So people listen because they know that, you know, that the Catholic Church is such a huge player on the ground, that we have what they call really grassroots level access. I mean, look at Caritas, for instance. Caritas Internationalis is a network of around 167, you know, national chapters. So with you know, the United Nations doesn't even have that presence. You know, the United Nations has very limited presence in terms of covering the ground. You know, I still remember when I was in Madagascar in the early 90s, you know, when a UN agency says, oh, we have vaccinated, let's say, 1,000 kids this year. I would say, well, our nuns do it every day. And they are all in the villages, you know, they're running schools, they're running clinics. So that's the kind of really what makes the Catholic Church is a credible and really a concrete player in all these things, because its presence, its capillary, it has expertise on the ground, it has credibility on the ground, simply because it is everywhere. You couldn't say it of a single state, for instance. I mean, you know, I mean, what's the reach in terms of politics of food, for instance, as you said? I mean, the Catholic Church, if it doesn't even have to acquire food from somewhere else in order to feed the hungry. Sometimes they have their own resources locally. Sometimes a much global and almost like a satellite view of things would also, you know, the concrete realities on the ground also gets lost. And that's why it's, you know, the politics of food donation, especially in the international scale, it's very challenging, and just like the question of development. You know, I have had a privilege to participate as either as head of the Holy See delegation in all these international conferences, financing for development, the 2030 agenda. You know, we negotiated that, the new global compact on migration, the global compact on refugees, and all those things. These are our daily bread, we might say, for my work. So we have seen also the complexities of how these policies of making this international aid, food, or you know, clean water for everybody is really being implemented on the ground. As you said, politics do come in. Politics do play a role in how these problems are being seen, and or even programs which are already approved or adopted, implemented on the ground.
Is much of our work impeded because of, you know, some type of dictatorship or some type of religious differences? Is the work that the church tries to do oftentimes stopped?
It is, I couldn't cite a very concrete example now, but of course in some places it has been. But I must say that as Catholic institutions, I think we have had really good access because our, international institutions like the Catholic Relief Services or Caritas, they are already very well known on the ground, and in most cases, if not in all cases, they have been found to be really politically neutral. They are real humanitarian agencies without political interests. It couldn't be said of, let's say, a state aid agency that in states in which don't have good relations with the other state, usually they would be impeded. They would put so many requirements and all these things. Political, for instance, just cite a concrete example in Syria. Even the United Nations have very difficult access to many of the areas in Syria, either because the government doesn't want them to go there, or either because some of their agents there are considered to be not completely neutral. All these things. As far as I know, our aid agencies in the Middle East have had very good access to all these refugee camps, to areas which are in difficulty. Sometimes, of course, for the safety of your humanitarian agents, you are advised not to go to certain specific areas. But in terms of access to these countries, as far as I know, I haven't heard of really very significant impediments, you might say, for our humanitarian agencies to work in.
Okay. It's I want people to know this. I want people to hear this, because as the church struggles with some of our modern issues, I want people to understand that the church has been heroic worldwide. We have been the biggest provider, if you will,
yes,
of human dignity services worldwide. And we have a few bad players, and it tends to color everything.
Yes, indeed. I would like to point out one thing that might not is also very important in our work. That's mediation. The peaceful settlement of disputes. The Catholic Church, the local Catholic Church, and the Holy See itself, they have been playing some really very significant, if not decisive, roles in terms of mediation, in terms of bringing political solution to certain aspects. I think that's also very important because, one other thing, for instance, I've been talking about the question of migration. There are 250 million people in the world today, 265 million, that's the last estimate of the United Nations, crossing international borders.
Wow.
So these 265 million do not include what we call internally displaced person who don't cross international borders but are displaced within their own countries.
We're going to need to leave it there,
yes,
Archbishop, but we're going to have you back for another show.
Okay,
Archbishop, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Father.
You.